A doctor told his mother to end the pregnancy. She refused. That child, born blind, raised on a Tuscan farm, separated from his family before he finished learning to be a child, would go on to sell 90 million records and be called, by the greatest tenor alive, the most beautiful voice he had ever heard. But before the concert halls, before the papal audiences, before the empty cathedral and the Olympic stage, there was a football pitch, an ordinary afternoon, and the moment that took the last of the light. How does a 12-year-old boy lose everything he can see and still find a way to make the world stop and listen? What did a blind lawyer from a small Italian town have that Pavarotti recognized before the rest of us did? And what is it exactly that lives beneath that voice? Before we answer, we need to go back to where it all began. There is a particular kind of childhood that exists only in the space between what is and what should have been. Andrea Bocelli lived inside that space from the moment he could understand that the world he experienced was not the world others described to him. He could see, partially, imperfectly, with the fragile remnant of vision that the glaucoma had not yet consumed. Colors arrived to him muted, as though viewed through water. Shapes existed at the edges of clarity, present but unreliable. And yet, to a child who had known nothing else, this was simply the world. Not a diminished world, not a broken world. Just the world. And he moved through it with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who had never been told he should be afraid of it. His mother made certain of that. Eddie Bocelli ran the household with a warmth that did not soften into pity. She cooked, she worked the farm alongside her husband Sandro, and she watched her son with the careful attention of a woman who understood that observation was its own form of protection. When Andrea stumbled, she let him find his footing. When he reached, she did not reach for him first. The farm in Lajatico, its red soil, its cypress trees standing like sentinels along the ridgeline, its mornings that smelled of earth and bread, became his earliest classroom. He learned the geography of it by touch and sound and the particular weight of air before rain. And then there was the music. It arrived early, the way essential things always do, not as a decision, but as a recognition. Andrea was drawn to the piano before anyone thought to place him at one. He listened to his parents' records with a concentration that bordered on hunger. Opera, particularly. Those vast human voices filling rooms too small to contain them, carrying emotions that had no other form of transport. He absorbed it all, filed it somewhere beneath language, beneath thought, in the place where the body stores what it cannot yet explain. He began formal piano lessons young, guided by teachers who quickly understood that what sat before them was not simply a child with enthusiasm. Something more precise was happening. Something that required patience and space rather than correction. At 5 months old, the doctors had named his condition. At 5 years old, the boy had already begun to answer it, not with defiance, not with tragedy, but with the quiet accumulation of a life being built note by note, color by color, in a world that still held light. For now, there is a moment in every life that functions as a dividing line, before and after. For Andrea Bocelli, that moment arrived on an ordinary afternoon when he was 12 years old, on a football pitch near Lajatico, in the middle of a game that should have meant nothing beyond the particular joy of boys running in the sun. He was playing goalkeeper, a position he had never played before, would never play again. The ball came fast and without warning, struck him directly in the right eye, the only eye through which any light still entered his world. The impact was violent, immediate. The kind of collision that silences everyone present before anyone understands why. He collapsed. The hemorrhage that followed was not simply physical. It was cosmological. The blood that flooded behind his eye extinguished the last remaining light in a life that had been built with extraordinary care and courage around its preservation. Doctors worked with everything available to them, including, in a detail that carries the particular cruelty of medical desperation, leeches placed around the eye in the ancient hope that reducing pressure might restore what had been lost. It could not. Nothing could. Andrea Bocelli was 12 years old when permanent and total blindness fell over him like a curtain that would never again be raised. His brother Alberto, watching it happen, would later find only 6 words sufficient to describe the moment. That's when darkness fell. 6 words. And in them, an entire world ending. What followed was not a single crisis, but a sustained one. The long, grinding work of relearning everything. How to move through spaces that had previously offered at least the suggestion of visual information. How to read, now in Braille, with fingertips that had to become eyes. How to locate himself in rooms, on roads, in a countryside he had known by sight, and now had to know by sound and memory and the particular feeling of wind direction against his face. He did not collapse inward. This is the fact that history records and that those who knew him confirm. He did not surrender to the darkness the way darkness invites surrender. He learned Braille with the same ferocity his mother had modeled. No excuses, figure it out. And he continued his music, continued his piano, continued to sing in the way that children sing before they understand singing as anything other than breathing with intention. But the school system had its own answer to what his life should now look like. At the age of 7, before the accident, already contending with severely compromised vision, he had been sent to a special school for the visually impaired in a nearby town. He came home only during holidays. His family visited once a month. Once a month. The loneliness of that arrangement, its particular shape, a child separated from everything familiar, learning to navigate institutional life before he had finished learning to navigate childhood, would leave marks that no biography fully measures. After the accident, that separation deepened. The world of the sighted continued at its ordinary pace. Andrea Bocelli continued at his, slower in some ways, more deliberate, more internal. Building something in the dark that the light had never quite allowed him to see clearly. A boy of 12. Total blindness. Separated from his family. Learning the world again from the beginning. Most people would have stopped there. Most people would have called that enough. So what made Andrea Bocelli refuse to call it enough? And what did that refusal cost him? The University of Pisa does not appear, at first glance, in the mythology of Andrea Bocelli. It belongs to a chapter that fame tends to skip. The years before the world knew his name, when he was simply a young blind man from Lahatico making decisions that nobody around him fully understood. He enrolled in the law faculty, not as a compromise, not as a concession to practicality pressed upon him by well-meaning adults who doubted the alternative. He enrolled because he had decided, with the same deliberate clarity that characterized everything he did, that he would build a life that could stand on its own foundations, independent of a dream that had not yet been given permission to become real. The coursework was formidable for any student. For a blind student in an era before digital accessibility, before screen readers and adaptive technology had matured into reliability, it required a particular kind of endurance. He read in Braille. He memorized with a precision that his classmates, with their notebooks and highlighted pages, could not easily match. He moved through the university the way he had moved through everything since the age of 12, by building an internal map detailed enough to substitute for what his eyes could not provide. And at night, he sang. Not in concert halls. Not yet. In bars and small clubs around Pisa. In the particular atmosphere of late evenings where the audience was not there to be elevated, but simply to be accompanied through another few hours of ordinary life. He played piano. He sang. He was paid modestly. He used the money to fund his studies and to sustain the slow, patient discipline of a musician who had not yet found his stage, but who understood, at some level beneath ambition, that the stage would eventually find him. He graduated, formally, completely, with the credentials of a man who had met the law on its own terms and satisfied them. He then worked for 1 year as a court-appointed lawyer, showing up, filing documents, representing clients, doing the work. Not performing, not waiting, working. This detail matters more than it is usually given credit for. It speaks to something foundational in Andrea Bocelli's character, a refusal to treat his gift as an exemption from responsibility, a refusal to use his circumstances as either excuse or mythology. He had a degree. He used it. He had a voice. He was still learning what to do with it. The bars of Pisa had been generous teachers. But the real education was coming, and it would arrive not from a conservatory or a concert stage, but from a phone call and a name that even the darkness recognized. He had a law degree, a steady income, a life that made sense by every conventional measure. So why would a blind man from a small Tuscan town walk away from all of it for a voice that the world had not yet asked to hear? In 1992, a phone call arrived that Andrea Bocelli had not planned for and could not have engineered. The caller was not a record executive, not a talent scout, not the machinery of the music industry moving in its usual calculated directions. The caller was Zucchero, one of Italy's most celebrated pop artists, a man with the kind of instinct for sound that does not require explanation, only trust. Zucchero was preparing a demonstration recording of a song called Miserere. He needed a tenor, not a finished star, a voice, someone who could lay down the melody with sufficient power and purity that the man he intended to send it to would understand what the song was capable of becoming. That man was Luciano Pavarotti, the greatest operatic tenor alive, a voice so recognized, so embedded in the world's understanding of what a human throat could produce, that his approval was not simply an endorsement, it was a verdict. Bocelli recorded the demo. He stood in a studio, a blind lawyer from Lahatico who had spent his evenings singing in bars for students and late-night drinkers. And he sang Miserere with everything the song required, and then, almost without effort, with something more. Something that the microphone caught, and the tape preserved, and that Zucchero recognized immediately as the thing he had been looking for, without knowing precisely what shape it would take. He sent the recording to Pavarotti. What happened next belongs to the small category of moments in music history that resist embellishment, because the truth is already extraordinary. Pavarotti listened. And then Pavarotti said, with the authority of a man who had spent a lifetime inside the upper atmosphere of vocal achievement, that he had never heard a more beautiful voice. Not more promising, not more interesting, more beautiful. From Pavarotti, about a demo, recorded by a man who had never released an album. The world did not know yet, but it was about to. Bocelli's debut album, Il mare calmo della sera, arrived in 1994. It introduced him to Italy with the quiet force of something that does not announce itself loudly because it does not need to. The voice did the announcing. Critics noticed. Audiences responded. And then, in 1996, something happened that moved the story from national to planetary. Romanza. The album arrived without the kind of aggressive commercial campaign that the music industry typically deploys when it believes it has something. It did not need one. Romanza spread the way certain things spread, not through promotion but through people, through the particular human impulse to hand something beautiful to someone else and say, simply, listen. It sold 15 million copies. It became one of the best-selling albums in recording history. A blind tenor from a Tuscan farm, who had graduated in law and spent his nights in Pisan bars, had just recorded one of the most commercially successful classical crossover albums the world had ever seen. And he was not finished. Sacred arias followed. And where Romanza had been an introduction, Sacred Arias was a declaration. It became the best-selling classical album by a solo artist in history, a record that still stands. 90 million albums sold across a career that had begun not in a conservatory, but in a courtroom, not on a stage, but behind a bar piano in a university town where nobody knew his name and everybody knew his voice. 6 Grammy nominations, 6 Latin Grammy nominations, a Golden Globe, 7 Classical Brit Awards, a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, performances for heads of state, for pontiffs, for crowds gathered in open fields and ancient amphitheaters and concert halls whose acoustics had been built for exactly this kind of voice and had never, until now, received it. 90 million records. Every major award his industry offers. The most celebrated classical voice of his generation. And he achieved all of it without ever seeing a single stage he walked onto. So what does Andrea Bocelli see? When the lights come up and the world goes quiet, and there is nothing left to do but sing? There is a version of Andrea Bocelli that the world constructed for itself. And it is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. The version the world constructed is luminous and sorrowful and triumphant in equal measure. A blind man with an angel's voice. A tragedy redeemed by gift. A story whose arc moves cleanly from darkness to light in the way that satisfying stories are supposed to move. The man himself has never been entirely comfortable with that version. He has said, with the particular directness of someone who has spent a lifetime navigating other people's interpretations of his existence, that the fact of his blindness is not what defines his life, that it should be of no more interest, in his own words, than his blood type. Not a wound, not a miracle. Simply a fact. One among many facts that constitute a human being who is, before anything else, a human being. This insistence is not performance. It is not the carefully managed humility of a public figure trained to deflect. It is the genuine philosophical position of a man who grew up inside a family that refused to organize itself around his limitation, and who internalized that refusal so completely that he now offers it back to the world as the only honest account of his life he is willing to give. His faith is the other pillar. Andrea Bocelli is a Catholic in the way that some people are Catholic, not as cultural inheritance or seasonal observance, but as the operating architecture of his existence. He has described his faith as the reason for his life, not a comfort, not a supplement, the reason, the framework inside which everything else, the voice, the blindness, the loss, the success, the love, finds its meaning and its place. He met Veronica Berti in 2002. She was 12 years younger, determined, and possessed of the kind of clarity about what she wanted that tends to organize the space around it. They married in 2014 in a ceremony in Lahatico, the same town where a doctor had once advised his mother to end the pregnancy that became him. He has 3 children, Amos and Mateo from his first marriage, and Virginia, born to him and Veronica in 2012, 2 years before their wedding. Mateo has followed his father into music. Their duet, Fall on Me, released in 2018, introduced a new generation to a name that the previous generation had already claimed as its own. The Andrea Bocelli Foundation was built on the same principle his mother had pressed into him before he was old enough to resist it. No excuses. Figure it out. The foundation works in communities fractured by poverty and disaster, using education as the primary instrument of restoration. It operates not as charity in the traditional sense, not as the delivery of resources to passive recipients, but as the construction of capacity. The belief that what people need is not to be saved, but to be equipped. This too is Andrea Bocelli. Not the voice alone, the man who holds the voice, the son of Eddie, the husband of Veronica, the father of 3, the former lawyer, the farmer's boy from Lahatico who learned the world by touch and rebuilt it by sound, behind 90 million records and a voice the world calls miraculous. There is a man who says his blindness is no more interesting than his blood type. A man who says faith is the reason for everything. A man who built a foundation on his mother's words. So what does a life like that look like? When the music stops, and the stage goes dark, and there is only the ordinary. There is a specific kind of courage required to walk onto a stage you cannot see. Not the metaphorical courage of vulnerability or artistic exposure. The literal, physical courage of placing your feet on a surface you have mapped only in your mind, in front of a crowd whose size you can feel in the air pressure and the particular quality of silence that mass human attention produces, and then opening your mouth and trusting that what comes out will be sufficient. Andrea Bocelli has done this thousands of times. The stages accumulated across 3 decades in the way that extraordinary things accumulate when they are built on genuine foundations rather than manufactured momentum. Carnegie Hall, the Royal Albert Hall, the Colosseum in Rome, its ancient stone receiving a voice that the centuries it had witnessed could not have anticipated. Red Rocks Amphitheater under a Colorado sky, the Forbidden City in Beijing, where he became the first Western artist ever permitted to perform. The Statue of Liberty Plaza, with the New York harbor behind him and an audience that stretched as far as the water. He walked onto each of them the same way. No cane in performance, eyes closed, not as affectation, not as theatrical gesture, but because the visual field he does not have cannot distract him from the auditory one he inhabits completely. He has described the experience of performing not as an act of courage, but as an act of surrender, to the music, to the moment, to something larger than the specific coordinates of a body standing on a specific stage. The audiences did not always know what to do with him at first. There is a particular human discomfort that arises in the presence of someone whose capabilities radically exceed the expectations that their circumstances seem to set. People came prepared for something moving, something poignant, something tinged with the particular emotion that attaches itself to stories of overcoming. What they received instead was simply singing, but singing of a quality that reorganized the air in the room and left people uncertain afterward how to account for what had happened to them. Pavarotti had understood this from the first demo. The 2 men became friends. Genuine friends, not the ceremonial friendship of mutual celebrity, but the kind that forms between people who recognize in each other something that does not require explanation. Pavarotti said of Bocelli that his voice was a gift from God. He said it not as flattery, but as taxonomy, as the most accurate classification available. When Pavarotti died in 2007, Bocelli lost not only a friend, but a witness. Someone who had been present at the beginning of the story that the rest of the world had only encountered mid-chapter. The grief was real, and it was private, and it was the kind that does not resolve cleanly, because what was lost was irreplaceable in the specific way that first believers are always irreplaceable. But the stages continued, because the music does not pause for grief, because the voice that Pavarotti had identified as the most beautiful he had ever heard did not diminish with loss. It deepened, as voices do, when the life behind them accumulates enough weight to give them something true to carry. There are moments in a life that arrive without invitation and refuse to be categorized. They are not triumphs in the conventional sense. They do not fit the architecture of achievement that biographies are usually built around. They are something quieter and stranger and more permanent. Moments that the person who lived them will carry not as memories, but as landmarks, fixed points around which everything else continues to orient itself. Andrea Bocelli has had several of these, but two stand above the others in the particular quality of their weight. The first was a concert, a single concert on a single evening in a city that was not expecting what it received. On Easter Sunday of 2020, the world was locked inside itself. The pandemic had emptied every public space on Earth with a swiftness that no generation alive had previously experienced. Streets that had never been quiet were silent. Churches that had never been closed were closed. The ordinary architecture of human gathering, the thing that concerts and ceremonies and collective worship had always provided, had been suspended without a date of return. The Cathedral of Milan opened its doors, not to a crowd, to cameras, and to Andrea Bocelli. He walked to the organ. He sang, alone in one of the most magnificent spaces in Christendom, with no audience present and the entire world watching through screens in rooms where they sat in varying degrees of fear and exhaustion and longing for something they could not yet name. He sang Ave Maria. He sang Sancta Maria. He walked out of the cathedral and into the empty Piazza del Duomo, a square that on any ordinary Easter would have been filled with tens of thousands of people. And he sang Amazing Grace into the silence. More than 2 million people watched it live. In the days that followed, the recording accumulated views at a pace that the platforms themselves struggled to process. By the time the immediate moment had passed, more than 40 million people had watched a blind man sing alone into an empty square on Easter Sunday during a global pandemic, and had found in it something that the circumstances of their own confinement had not been able to provide. He did not plan it as a statement, he planned it as a service. The distinction is everything. The second moment was different in every external detail, but identical in its internal quality. In 2026, the Winter Olympics came to Milan. The opening ceremony at San Siro, a stadium that holds more than 75,000 people, a structure of concrete and noise and collective human energy, required a voice for its most significant moment. They chose Bocelli. He walked onto the stage without a cane, eyes closed. The stadium fell into the particular silence that only music can produce in spaces built for noise. He sang for the world, for the athletes assembled from every nation, for the cameras transmitting to audiences in every time zone simultaneously. He did not see the lights. He did not see the crowd. He felt them, in the air, in the temperature of collective attention, in the way that 75,000 people breathing together creates something that is almost tactile. When he finished, the silence held for a moment longer than silences usually hold. And then it broke. These were not accidents. They were not the random distribution of opportunity across a career. They were the arrival of specific moments at the feet of the one person whose combination of voice and history and character made him capable of filling them completely. The world did not give Andrea Bocelli these stages out of pity or out of the particular sentimentality that attaches itself to stories of disability overcome. It gave them to him because nothing else would do. There is a question that follows Andrea Bocelli through every interview, every profile, every attempt to account for a life that does not fit the usual explanatory frameworks. The question takes different forms depending on who is asking, but its core is always the same. How? How did you endure the blindness without bitterness? How did you build what you built without sight? How did you walk onto those stages, into those silences, carrying all of that history, and sing? He has answered it many times, and the answer has never changed. Faith, not as abstraction, not as the polite invocation of spirituality that public figures sometimes deploy when they want to signal depth without committing to specifics. Andrea Bocelli is a Catholic in the most complete sense of the word, a man for whom the doctrines and sacraments and daily practices of his faith are not supplementary to his life, but constitutive of it. He has said, with a directness that leaves no room for misinterpretation, that faith is for him the reason for life. Not a reason. The reason. The framework inside which everything, the voice, the darkness, the loss, the love, the music, finds its coherence and its purpose. This is not a position he arrived at through crisis and subsequent conversion. It is not the faith of a man who turned to God when everything else failed. It is the faith of a man who was raised inside it, who tested it against the particular hardships of his life, and who found that it did not break, that it held. That the darkness of 12 years old and the isolation of institutional schooling and the loneliness of building a career that nobody around him could fully see, that all of it could be carried inside a framework that gave suffering a context without minimizing its weight. He prays, daily, not performatively, not for the cameras. He has described prayer not as petition, but as conversation. The ongoing dialogue of a man with something larger than himself that he trusts to be listening. The Catholic tradition he inhabits is one that has always understood music as a form of worship, that the voice raised in song is not separate from the voice raised in prayer, but continuous with it. For Bocelli, this is not metaphor. When he sings sacred music, the Ave Marias, the Panis Angelicus, the Agnus Dei that appear throughout his catalogue, he is not performing devotion. He is enacting it. His mother planted this. Eddie Bocelli was a woman of faith as well as a woman of ferocious practical discipline, and she understood these two things not as contradictions, but as expressions of the same orientation toward life. The belief that the world is not random, that suffering is not meaningless, that the appropriate response to difficulty is not despair, but engagement. No excuses. Figure it out. Behind that instruction, if you listen carefully enough, is a theological position. The world is worth engaging. You are capable of engaging it. Now go. Andrea Bocelli went, and the faith that his mother carried him inside, the faith that survived the football pitch and the hospital and the boarding school and the bars of Pisa and the courtrooms of Tuscany, that faith is audible if you know how to listen in every note he has ever sung. It is the thing beneath the voice, the reason the voice carries as far as it does. Matteo Bocelli has his father's cheekbones and something of his father's voice. not a copy, but a continuation. A sound that carries in it the particular quality of inheritance, the way certain things pass between generations, not through instruction, but through proximity and love, and the slow absorption of what it means to be someone's child. Their duet, Fall on Me, released in 2018, was not a publicity exercise. It was a document. A father and son standing together in a recording studio, their voices finding each other in the space between melody and harmony, producing something that neither could have produced alone. It introduced Matteo to a world that already knew his father's name. And it introduced that world to the possibility that what Andrea Bocelli had built was not merely a career, but a lineage. The Andrea Bocelli Foundation operates on the same principle. Built on his mother's instruction, no excuses, figure it out, it works in communities broken by poverty and disaster, not delivering aid but constructing capacity. Schools rebuilt after earthquakes, educational programs in Haiti, in Kosovo, in sub-Saharan Africa. The belief, foundational and uncompromising, that what people need is not rescue, but equipment. Not to be saved, but to be enabled. He does not discuss the foundation the way celebrities discuss their philanthropic work, as evidence of conscience or appendix to fame. He discusses it as work, as the other work. The work that happens when the singing stops and the stages go dark and there is still something left to do. At 66, he continues, "The voice has not diminished in the ways that voices are supposed to diminish. It has changed, deepened, settled, acquired the particular authority that only time and experience can deposit in a sound. He performs selectively now, with the discernment of a man who understands that presence is not the same as frequency. When he appears, it matters. When he sings, the world still stops. His home is in Lahatico, the same countryside where a doctor once told his mother to end the pregnancy, where he learned the land by touch before he lost the ability to see it, where Veronica and Virginia and the ordinary textures of a family life continue to constitute the majority of his hours. Not the stages, not the awards, not the 90 million records that his name will carry into whatever comes after. He has said he does not think about legacy in the abstract. He thinks about the people in the room. A doctor said he should never have been born. He was born anyway, on a farm in Tuscany, into a family that refused to organize itself around his limitation, raised by a woman whose love expressed itself not as protection, but as preparation. He lost his sight at 12 on an ordinary afternoon that became the dividing line of his life. He learned the world again from the beginning. He studied law. He sang in bars. He recorded a demo for a man who sent it to Pavarotti. And Pavarotti said he had never heard anything more beautiful. He sold 90 million records. He sang in the empty Piazza del Duomo while the world watched from inside its locked rooms and found in his voice something the circumstances of that moment had taken from them. He walked onto the stage at San Siro without a cane, eyes closed, and sang for the world at the opening of the Winter Olympics. He built a foundation on his mother's words. He raised 3 children. He married in the town where his story began. And through all of it, the blindness, the isolation, the bars of Pisa, the courtrooms of Tuscany, the recording studios and the concert halls and the ancient amphitheaters and the papal audiences, he maintained with a consistency that borders on the philosophical that none of it defines him, that the darkness is not the story, that the voice is not the miracle, that the reason for everything underneath the music and the faith and the family and the foundation is something quieter and more durable, than any of those things individually. He is a man who was forged, not destroyed. A man whose darkness did not silence him. It clarified him. Stripped away everything that was not essential until what remained was the voice and the faith and the love and the refusal, inherited from his mother and tested by everything life placed in front of him, to treat any of it as an excuse. The stages will continue. The voice will continue. The ordinary mornings in Lahatico will continue. The red soil, the cypress trees, the particular quality of Tuscan light that he has not seen in more than 50 years, and that he has never stopped, in his own way, carrying. What the darkness took from Andrea Bocelli, it could not keep, because what it could not take was the only thing that ever truly mattered. The voice was always there, waiting, and it is still waiting, for the next stage, the next silence, the next moment when the world goes quiet and a blind man from a small Italian town opens his mouth and reminds us, without effort and without apology, what a human being is capable of becoming. If this story moved you, if Andrea Bocelli's journey left something in you that was not there before, leave a comment below and tell us which moment stayed with you most. Was it the football pitch at 12 years old? The empty cathedral on Easter Sunday? The stage at San Siro? The demo that stopped Pavarotti? Tell us. Your words become part of this story too. If you believe someone needs to hear this today, share this video. Not for the algorithm, for them. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe now. Because the stories we tell here are not about fame. They are about what human beings do when everything is taken from them, and they choose still to sing.